Hello, I'm Donna Ozarko, Manager of Officials and Publications for Softball Canada. Welcome to today's Concussions Awareness Workshop for Softball Canada's umpire leaders.
And I'm Jeff Whipple. I'm the National Director of Umpires. Participating in sport comes with all kinds of inherent risks. Umpires in fast pitch often take a foul ball off the mask, while line drives to the corners place slow pitch umpires in the line of fire every game. New technologies can help protect us, but it's still important we're able to recognize when we or another participant in the game need to be evaluated after a potential head injury.
Today, we are fortunate enough to be joined by two of the experts from Parachute Canada's national charity dedicated to reducing the devastating impact of preventable injuries. Stephanie Cowle is the Director of Knowledge Translation for Parachute. Stephanie has spent more than a decade working in the area of injury and trauma prevention. Since 2016, Stephanie has led Parachute's national projects to improve concussion prevention, recognition, and management across Canada, working with more than 50 national sport bodies, as well as government, health, and education stakeholders at a national and provincial levels.
Rachel Lamont is the Coordinator of Knowledge Translation and Programs for Parachute. Rachel holds a Master in Public Health degree from the University of Toronto, and she joined the Parachute team in 2019. Rachel has collaborated with various sports organizations to develop concussion education resources and leads Parachute's Smart Hockey program.
Rachel and Stephanie, welcome, and thank you for taking the time to join us.
Thank you so much, Donna and Jeff, for such a wonderful, warm welcome. Thank you also for working with us to put together this event tonight. And thanks to all of you for joining us here tonight and being a part of this conversation. What I want to remind you of before we get started is you were provided by email an example of the concussion recognition tool. It's a sheet that kind of looks like this. I don't know if you can see it in my camera. I'd like to make sure that you have that on hand. If you have a print copy or if you have just a copy on your screen, we're going to use that tool in a little while. So make sure that you have it on hand somewhere with you. As Donna mentioned, Rachel and I are here tonight from Parachute. We are Canada's national charity dedicated to preventing serious and fatal injuries caused by the leading causes in Canada. So this includes sport injuries, motor vehicle collisions, drowning, falls, a lot of different aspects. The work that we do primarily with the sports sector is a focus on preventing concussions and also preventing the consequences of concussions. Concussion is a unique injury in the work that we do because not only is it important to prevent them from happening in the first place if we can, but it's also important to recognize them and treat them properly because that actually will, in many cases, reduce the long-term effects. So there's a few different points where it's really important for us to potentially intervene. Rachel and I are going to tell you a little bit about ourselves, so you know who's here giving you this information tonight. So I'll hand it over to Rachel, my co-presenter, to tell you a little bit about her.
Yeah, thanks, Steph. So hi, everyone. I'm Rachel Lamont, and as Jeff kindly outlined, I am a knowledge translation and programs coordinator at Parachute. So I'm fortunate enough to work very closely with Steph on our organization's concussion work, including developing concussion education resources with various sport organizations. And as Jeff mentioned, I also lead our Parachute Smart Hockey program, which is focused on concussion prevention in hockey. I'm so glad to be here tonight with all of you guys, and I'll pass it over to Steph.
Thanks, Rachel. So I've worked with almost every national sport in Canada to some degree, working on concussion protocols and policies, as well as concussion education. I have worked with Softball Canada for a number of years and really do want to commend the leadership at Softball Canada for supporting improvement in this area for the sport and presenting an opportunity like we have tonight. On a personal side, I've also played softball pretty much my whole life. I started out in T-ball, played a little fast pitch, and as most of us do, have played slow pitch for a lot of my adult life. And softball was what I was doing when I got my first and only concussion. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So definitely have a love of the sport. And so on a personal side, I'm really happy to be here tonight and work with you. In addition to that, I also would like to mention that I actually live with a sport official, not a softball umpire, but a hockey referee. So I really do appreciate that the game can't happen without you, and all the work that you do to maintain your training and maintain your knowledge of the game and the rules. So I'm a supporter of officials, so thank you for all you do for the game and for being here tonight to advance your knowledge and understand how you can play a role in continuing to make the game safe for all participants. What we're going to do tonight is really help to build your knowledge and your confidence in being able to recognize signs and symptoms of a possible concussion. We also will help you understand what to do if you do suspect a concussion, and have a little bit of understanding about what happens following a concussion. What does return to sport look like? We're going to focus more heavily on those two initial pieces. That's really more important to your role as an umpire in the sport. So we really want to focus there and help you understand what you can do. I do want to mention that throughout the presentation, we really do encourage you to submit comments, questions, ideas, anecdotes through the chat box. I think Jeff is going to help us manage that chat box piece. We've inserted some deliberate points of discussion and some points of practice throughout the presentation, but we also encourage you to chat throughout. We'll kind of respond as is appropriate. If we're going to get to it, we'll get to it eventually. Just keep the communication coming and don't be afraid to ask questions. We're really happy to this is your opportunity to get those questions out, anything you might be wondering. The information that we're presenting here tonight is based on the most current evidence we have about concussion. So it reflects a best practice approach to concussion. And there's a couple of key documents I want to mention. The first is that the information reflects the most recent research that we have reflected in the consensus statement on concussion in sport. This is something that's published every 4 years and explains where the current state of the research is. There actually was supposed to be another one just last month, but due to COVID-19, it has been delayed till next year. So this is still the most current version of this statement that we have. We also work together with sport organizations, with Sport Canada, and concussion experts from across Canada to develop a Canadian guideline specifically aimed at sport organizations and sport stakeholders to take the research and put it into what does this mean for sport? What's the approach within a sport organization? And that's in the Canadian Guideline, which is available on Parachute's website. I also want to note that the information in this presentation does align with Softball Canada's concussion policy, which is built off that guideline. It also reflects accurate information that aligns with Rowan's Law if you are located in Ontario, and I'll reference Rowan's Law a couple of times. The reason I mention this is I want you to know that what we're presenting tonight should not conflict with any other information that you're receiving from these credible sources of information. So the information you learn here tonight will help you follow those same guidelines that are out there from other places. And it's really important that we have a consistent message and a consistent way of approaching concussion. I imagine we do have some residents of Ontario here tonight. And if you are, you may already be aware that Ontario officials are subject to Rowan's Law, meaning that you will be required to review the government's official resources and the code of conduct of your sport organization. And more of that information is on the government website at ontario.ca. So what's the game plan for tonight? There are a number of questions we're going to focus on to meet those learning objectives I mentioned earlier. We're going to talk about what exactly is a concussion, what causes it, what are some examples of what you might see in softball, You know, when should your ears prick up? When should you think that there might be a concussion here? What are those signs and symptoms to look for? What might indicate that it might be more serious than a concussion, a more serious brain or spinal cord injury? What do you do in that case? We'll talk, of course, then about what should you do if you have that suspicion, whether it's of a concussion or a more serious injury. And we'll also talk, as I said, a little bit about what that return process looks like. And we want to talk about prevention. What can you do in your role to help contribute to a safer participation environment for everyone involved? And throughout, I'm going to refer a lot to the player, but the information also applies to whether you know, there's an injury to a spectator, an injury to a member of the umpiring crew, a coach. The general approach and principles are the same. So now I'm going to hand it off to Rachel, and Rachel is going to tell you a bit more about what exactly a concussion is.
Yeah, so to put it simply, a concussion is a brain injury. It affects the way the brain works, usually for a short period of time. But remember that, of course, the brain controls everything that we do. So from thinking to feeling to our decision making, and really our entire personality. So a brain injury can affect a person in a lot of different ways. We will go through some of the common symptoms you see with concussion later on in the presentation. But for now, it's important to know that a concussion is really an injury to brain function. So we can't see any actual injury to the structure of the brain, at least not using the technology that's currently available to us. And because of this, we can't actually see concussions come up on medical imaging tests like x-rays and scans. So what this means is that if someone has a suspected concussion, a health professional won't request a scan as it's not necessary. So they'll only likely do a scan if they're concerned about maybe a different type of head injury, like a fractured skull or a brain bleed. And even if an X-ray or scan is done and it comes back as with everything looking normal, this doesn't mean that there isn't an injury present. There certainly can still be a concussion that we're not seeing on these typical scans. So what can cause a concussion? I think a lot of people think that you have to have a direct hit to the head to suffer a concussion, but that's actually not the case. Concussions can really be caused by any impact to the body. So think, for example, anything that causes your head to move in that whiplash motion can cause a concussion to occur. So I'm going to play a quick clip for you guys that will demonstrate that motion of the brain inside the skull. So you can see here that the clip is demonstrating that movement of the brain inside the skull that can lead to a concussion. So like I said, imagine any type of sudden, rapid start and stop movement, like a hit to the head, that any movement causing a whiplash motion, like a fall, anything like that can cause that movement of the brain inside the skull.
I was having a hard time escaping our brain there. So we want to open it up and really encourage you to put some ideas in the group chat box. Knowing, hearing what you've just heard about how a concussion might be caused, or maybe building on something you've seen in the game before or experienced yourself, what are some ideas around, the ways we might see concussions caused in softball? I really encourage you to just throw some ideas in the chat box. What are some of the plays you might see? What are some of the instances where maybe a hit might happen in softball, maybe a concussion might occur? Anyone have any ideas? Yeah, so the first idea we see is player collision. So yeah, you know, say your shortstop going back to the field and you know, backs into the left fielder, and you have a collision there. You know, yeah, errant throw, foul ball off the catcher's mask, off the umpire's mask, a ball to the helmet in lots of different areas. We had an umpire hit by a, not sure what trout, maybe thrown ball to the head. Foul ball, direct pitch to the head. Yeah, particularly in, you know, more so in fast pitch, you might have a concern with a hit. And yeah, colliding with the fence in the play. I think that's something, you know, that's something I see on TV a lot when I'm watching Major League ball. I often brace myself when I see them going into the fence. Yeah, tough tag, you know, and you know, maybe even a trip, a hard slide, sliding head first, or sliding collision. So these are really great ideas. Thank you all for joining in that piece of the discussion. So what the literature tells us, and keep in mind, these are, you know, things we know from research studies and from records. So these aren't the only things that happen, but the top causes based on the research of what happens in softball for concussion is, for the younger ones, is being hit by a bat. For the older ones, this being, you know, adolescents, teens, and adults, it's more likely to happen being hit by a ball. And player collisions is also a common cause. But certainly all of the examples that were provided are excellent examples about how this potentially could occur. It's important to understand as well. Oh, I just noticed bat swing to the head. That's a good one as well. It's important to know also that, you know, we are going to focus on what happens if this occurs in the game. It can also happen, of course, in practice, but that's not your role to be there as an umpire. But it can also happen in non-sport. So there's a bit of a conception that a concussion is a sport injury. And part of that is because it's gotten a lot of media attention, and we do focus on sport concussion quite a bit. But you don't just take your brain to the softball game. You take your brain everywhere you go. So same principles apply. So, you know, hitting your head on a cupboard, a fall at work, a fall on ice is really common, a really common cause in Canada. A car crash where you have that whiplash that Rachel mentioned. So really important to know that this can also happen outside of the sport. Okay, so we do want to get right into talking about recognizing a possible concussion. So the statement on the screen says, while diagnosing concussion is the job of medical professionals, all sports stakeholders are responsible for recognizing and reporting suspected head injury. We use a really important word here, a couple of them actually. Some players don't take their brains to the game. There's nothing we can do about that. Recognition is a really important word. We wouldn't ask anyone who's not a health professional to diagnose a concussion. So no one's role at the game in terms of if you're an umpire, if you're a coach, if you're a spectator, a player on the field, your job is not to diagnose or say for certain, absolutely, this is or is not a concussion. Your job, or I shouldn't say your job, the role that you can help contribute is recognizing that there's a chance that a concussion might be present and helping move it forward to the next step. And that's why the other important word is suspected head injury. So again, we're not guaranteeing in the moment that a head injury has occurred. As Rachel mentioned, we don't even have even doctors don't have a specific test. They have to do, you know, a full medical assessment to determine in their judgment whether a concussion has occurred. So we're certainly not asking that of you. So what we're asking you to learn more about is how to recognize when a player or a fellow umpire might have a concussion, and then what you should do next. So when do you suspect a concussion? I'm going to talk about kind of the conditions And then we are going to share a little bit more about what the signs and symptoms actually are. So that is coming up. So when should you suspect a concussion? Well, here are kind of the criteria laid out. So first of all, there has to be an impact. So sometimes people get caught up in, oh, if a player has a headache, if a player is feeling nauseous, do they have a concussion? People kind of hone in on the symptom. But the first thing is there needs to be some sort of impact, some sort of causational force. So if that's, a collision between players, a ball or bat to the head, whatever it is, first there's an impact. And then, again, as Rachel said, not just to the head, but potentially to the body, the neck, that sort of thing. And if following that impact, there's any sign or symptom of concussion, that's enough to suspect a concussion. If after the impact, the player tells you or tells someone that they're experiencing concussion symptoms, that's enough to suspect a concussion. You didn't need to see it happen. If something happened and they're reporting that, that's enough for us to suspect a concussion. And if the athlete doesn't report it, but something happens and the coach or yourself as the umpire see that they're displaying some signs or symptoms, then that's enough to suspect a concussion. So you have an impact and you have some reason to believe, whether it's you've heard it directly, witnessed it directly, or heard from someone else reporting it, that there's a sign or symptom, that's enough. Let's talk about a couple misconceptions about concussion that continue to permeate our understanding, particularly within sport culture. So the first one is that you have to be knocked out to have a concussion. If you didn't black out, you're good to go. And this is actually not true. The fact of the matter is 90% of people never lose consciousness. So using that as a litmus test for whether or not there's a concussion clearly is not sort of a useful tool. The other thing to note, and we'll get into this a little bit more, if a person loses consciousness, it could actually be more serious than a concussion. So again, this is not the rule of thumb we want to be using. The other thing is that often people think if there's an impact and there isn't a symptom right away, if right after the impact, like, yeah, I kind of feel okay, then there's no concussion. The injury must appear right away. But again, the fact is that symptoms can actually evolve over time. So it could show up, the minutes and hours after the injury. It can even appear, in the next 24 to 48 hours. I know with my own personal experience with concussion, directly after the fact, I didn't have any symptoms. I did have a lump on my head, but I didn't have any symptoms. And it wasn't until the next day that, I started to get that throbbing headache. And had I not known, I might have thought everything was okay. So I'll hand it back to you, Rachel, to talk a little bit more about the different types of symptoms that we would be looking for.
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, concussions can affect a person in a lot of different ways. So concussion symptoms can be physical, mental, emotional, and sleep related. And each person can experience a concussion totally differently. And actually, the same person may not even have the same experience from one concussion to their next concussion. So overall, the most commonly reported symptom of a concussion is a headache, but some other physical symptoms can include dizziness, sensitivity to light or sound, experiencing blurred vision, or having a ringing in the ears as well. And concussions can also affect people mentally. So players could feel a little bit foggy or have difficulty remembering what happened leading up to their injury, or overall just feeling confused. And a person with a concussion might also express their emotions in ways that are unusual for them. So this can mean that they're more easily upset or angry, or they're just overall more emotional than they otherwise would be. And finally, a concussion can also affect sleep in a few different ways. So for example, someone with a concussion may have difficulty sleeping, and on the flip side, they actually might even sleep more than usual. So these are some common signs that you might witness visually if a person has a suspected or possible concussion. So for example, if a player's holding onto their head with their hands, they're slow to move, to get up, or they're just not moving quite right. Or if they're laying motionless on the field, of course, these are visual signs that they might have a concussion, and should be checked out. Okay, so when should you suspect that a person could have a more severe brain or spinal injury? Well, any one of these red flags, we call them, can be a sign of a more serious injury and should be treated as a medical emergency. So, for example, if the player has lost consciousness, if they've vomited more than once, or they're having convulsions, they've had a seizure, or they're experiencing any neck issues like tenderness in their neck, you should call 911 and activate your organization's emergency action plan if there is one available.
Thanks, Rach. And what's important to know is it's great for you to be aware of some of these signs and symptoms, some of the most common ones, but this isn't, it's not a requirement that you memorize this full list. There are a number of tools available to help you, recognize concussion, remember the signs and symptoms. The concussion recognition tool, which is now on the screen, is an example of one of those tools, and we'll talk about a couple others after. So what we want to do is take a look at this concussion recognition tool, walk you through a little bit of information about it, and then we're actually going to do a little practice looking at a scenario and looking at how we might use this tool. I really encourage you as we go through this to stay involved with this piece. It might feel a little odd to do this exercise virtually, but it's an important opportunity to start practice thinking about what you would look for, how you might react in this scenario, so that the first time that you're considering this isn't when it happens on the field. So the concussion recognition tool is an internationally used tool. It's developed by the same researchers that developed that consensus statement I referred to earlier. It's also recommended as a tool within Softball Canada's concussion policy and used by most sport organizations. This is not a tool intended for medical professionals. This is a tool that anyone can use. So any member of the general public. It's a good thing to have on hand in your bag, in your first aid kit, just to have in case you ever should need it. There's a few different sections to this tool, so I'll walk us through it, and then we'll try a little exercise. So the first section of the tool on the top left is recognize and remove. So we've been talking about recognition, and this kind of gives you the cues for when you would recognize and remove a player. And I mean that the general you, not necessarily the umpire you removing. We'll get to that after. So the first step is to figure out, is this a medical emergency? That's the first thing we want to know. And Rachel just reviewed what some of those red flag signs are. So you'll see those in that first red box. These are signs that could be a concussion, could be a more serious head or brain injury. So again, if you see a single one of these signs, that's activating a medical emergency potentially. Then from there, so if it is a medical emergency, that's where you stop with the tool. You don't need to go through the rest of the process. If it's an emergency, we act on that. If there are no red flags right away, then we look for the signs and symptoms, which are in the steps that follow. So you have kind of those visual signs. What did you see? You know, did you see the player really slow and unsteady getting up, grabbing their head while they're walking back to the bench? And then the symptoms, which are more things that need to be found out by actually talking to the player themselves. You know, you can't tell if they're necessarily feeling dizzy or having blurred vision. A lot of that you have to determine working together with the player. There's also another step on here that includes some memory questions. This is just kind of trying to get at, you know, where kind of the mental presence and mental state of the person is. So are they forgetting things? Are they feeling confused? These questions just help kind of determine if that's what's going on with their brain. If any one of these signs or symptoms or this confusion when trying to answer some pretty simple questions, if any of these are issues, that's enough to suspect concussion. And then the bottom right column of the tool then has some key points about what to do next. We're going to go into those in depth, but remember, you know, the general rules are there in terms of, you know, a player should be removed, a player should get checked out, they shouldn't be left alone, things like that. So I hope that many of you, if not all of you, do have a copy of this with you, have it on your screen or have it in front of you. Because what we're going to do now is look at a scenario and we're going to practice a little bit of where would we look on the tool, what would we be looking for, just to practice sort of the process of trying to recognize a concussion and acting on your instincts. I will say in advance, apologies that we don't specifically have a softball scenario video, but we're going to use the scenario that we have. And in terms of the type of incident we see, I think it's quite relatable to that, to a softball, what you might see in a softball collision. So I'm going to press play. What I want to assure you is there's no sound on the video, so there's not an issue with your audio if you don't hear anything. I'm going to play it a couple times and we're going to watch what's happening. It's just a really quick snippet. So we're just going to watch the play develop, just give you one quick chance to look at it. Let's see what happens. Okay, so that's a quick shot of the play. So now what I want you to do is take a look at it again, take a look at the concussion recognition tool and look at what, if you see anything as you're watching the scenario, where do you look on the tool? What do you see come up? So we talked about first, there has to be some reason, there has to be some type of impact, some reason to even think about suspecting a concussion. So do we see any type of impact here? And you can throw it in the chat box if you want to help us out here. Were there any impacts? Yes. Anyone want to give an example of what kind of impact we saw? Okay, so the head hit the ground. Did we see any other impacts on that play? Player to player, yeah, solid body contact, solid. So, you know, what I might, again, apologies if this isn't a specific softball scenario, but if we think about that scenario of the infielder backing up and colliding with the outfielder or two outfielders colliding, could be a similar kind of mechanism where you have the player to player contact. That could potentially be enough to cause a concussion. You have the hard hit on the ground and you have the actual, it looks like the head makes contact with the ground. So a lot of you said yes, that, that appears to be a situation where we saw an impact where, okay, our spidey sense is tingling a little bit. I might want to investigate and watch the player a little further. If you look at the first red box on the concussion recognition tool, I want to mention from the chat box, another good point is it was a bit of a blind side, so unexpected contact, and that can have an impact because if you're not bracing and you're kind of are hit and aren't prepared for it, aren't bracing your neck, that could actually impact how much your head is swaying. So that's a good observation. So I saw someone starting to talk about some signs, but let's look at that first red box, the red flags. Did we see anything that might alert us that this might be a situation of a medical emergency? Look at what's in the red box. Look at what's in the red flags. Did you notice anything in the scenario where you might say, this might be something more serious? We might want to call an emergency situation here. I'm getting some no's in. All right, I'll take 4 no's as a group consensus. Not really. Yeah, so there wasn't anything that clearly, if we look at the red flags, there was some neck contact, but and I'll come to that in a second, but there isn't any obvious sign just from what we visually saw. So the player she sat up, she grabbed her head, but she got it pretty quickly. She wasn't laying still on the ground. She didn't appear to lose consciousness. She's not coming up vomiting. She's not coming up, with any of those red signs. So at this point, we don't have any information that would, put up those alarm bells and tell us that this might be a medical emergency. Coming back to Lori's point about the neck, if we were actually to speak to the player and they started talking about their sore neck, we could consider that a red flag. For now, we've just used our vision. But some of them, so for example, double vision, sore neck, we would have to talk to the player to find out more information about those. So that's an excellent observation. Okay, what about, I saw one mention of clutching the head. So any visual signs from what you saw that there might be a concussion? So we saw the impact. We haven't seen necessarily any red flags, any potential signs. Okay, so yeah, she's definitely slower to get up than we would expect after that hit. She grabbed her head, she's hanging her head. Yeah, clutching it, kind of doubling over. She needed some time to get up, to get back in position, even to roll over on her back. So definitely seeing some visual signs there. So given, so far we haven't talked to the athlete, we've just kind of observed this collision. So far, do we think there's enough here to suspect a concussion? What would you think? No? Okay, we have a no. Any others? No? No? Okay, we have a yes. One sign or symptom after an impact is enough to suspect a concussion. We would want to ask her more questions to find out if there are other signs and symptoms, because that's important information to communicate to her parents, to her emergency contact, to her doctor. But those visual signs of an impact, clutching her head, slow to get up, that is enough. I really do mean it when I say one sign or symptom is enough. If we hadn't seen those visual signs, she gets up okay, she comes back, then we would move on to the next phase of the tool, looking at some of those symptoms that we need to ask the player about. So, how's her head feeling? Is she feeling dizzy? And sometimes people can't really express what exactly they're feeling. Sometimes it's just something feels off. I don't quite feel right. I want to stick this idea a little bit more, because we did have a lot of no's, which is okay. I'm wondering if I want to talk a little bit about our hesitation to say yes. And is it based on thinking, that's not enough to convince me? Is it you think that this could really impact the game, so I need someone to prove it more to me? If anyone's, this is personal and I don't want to put you on the spot, but if anyone's willing to share some ideas around, why maybe the signs that we saw wouldn't be enough to convince you, would make you hesitant. If anyone wants to share anything about this, I'm happy to discuss it further. Or if, drilling in that one sign or symptom is enough, and we want to move on, then that's okay too. But I do want to give us room, if we need to discuss it a bit further. If anyone has any questions about kind of this threshold for being able to say, I suspect a concussion here. So a couple of things. One, a humorous statement. So, the old joke about dives in soccer. So it does raise an interesting point in a sport of when do you take things seriously, and perhaps when do you think players are playing around. I think you have to trust your judgment. I know it's a joke, but I'm going to play off it anyways. You have to trust your judgment and assess what's happening in the situation. I do want to emphasize that a lot of this is going to be judgment calls and leaning into your training and the same kind of judgment you would use in any case, whether it's making a decision about the game or any other health and safety issue around the sport. You're calling in here the same kind of training and decision making and judgment that you would in other areas. Another comment about being old athletes that we need to suck it up. There certainly is this culture and this attitude that we all have spent a lot of our lives in, whether we play the sport or not, that it is something that you tough out. And I'm hoping by the end of this presentation, we're able to convince you a little bit more about why dealing with concussion is really important, and the fact that it is a brain injury is really important. I do think that we see this attitude shifting, and I hope that we can continue to make that shift go further. And I hope that those of you attending tonight can take a little bit of this information in and think about maybe some of the attitudes that you have about it as well. So in terms of actually, stopping the game, things like that, we haven't got there yet in terms of what the umpire's role is, and getting into this, would the game stop here? Would you call time in this instance? No, it's not. From what you've seen, it's not a serious medical emergency situation. You would wait for the play to finish. We're going to get into some of what you would actually do, but generally talking about recognizing and suspecting a concussion, it shouldn't matter. After contact, would a headache be a good indicator of concussion? It's certainly a symptom, and it's certainly enough to suspect a concussion. Could they have a headache for a different reason? Yes. If you get hit in the head, particularly, your head's going to hurt. It may be the outside hurting, not the inside. But again, we're not medical professionals making that distinction. So if there's an impact and their head is hurting, that's enough to suspect a concussion. And then it's a medical professional's job to determine what the source of that headache is. Yeah, I think we're having a little conversation here, and I'll let you continue talking about a little bit about what your reaction might be as an umpire, what you might actually do in this situation. That's something we're going to get to in a moment. But I do really want to make sure that we understand that, a sign or symptom is enough, in anyone's mind to suspect a concussion. There's a comment, if there's a symptom, let's caution on the side of safety. Absolutely. I'm just going to keep drilling in. It's a brain injury. So erring on the side of caution, particularly if it's a young person, is really important. And we're going to talk a little bit about why removal is recognition and removal is so important in a little bit.
Good luck.
You're trained to stay away from injuries. We're going to talk about that. Again, we're going to talk about what you'll actually do in this scenario. But for this first part, we just wanted to understand what a concussion causing injury might look like and what would be enough for anyone watching to suspect a concussion. Of course, what you do and do not do as an umpire, it is a specific role, and we're going to talk about what that means. So I'm glad you're already thinking about the response. Also, a good point that you may not see the signs. You may be you're following the play, and your task is to watch this base or to watch the tag up at third, whatever it is. Absolutely. So I think what's important here is that we're not saying that you all are the monitors of the situation. This is just, if you were to see this collision happen, would you suspect a concussion? Yes. So certainly in no way are you expected to be the sole people looking for this, that it's a new part of your job to be looking for this. The point is that anyone present at the game, whether it's a spectator, another player, a coach, or you as the umpire, if you see something and it's enough to suspect, then what do you do? So I'm going to move on, but absolutely, if you still have thoughts, concerns, questions, keep them coming in the chat. We're going to move on to that piece of what do we do? I also, as we go, I also welcome Jeff and Donna to pipe in if you think that there's something that you want to add to it from the umpire perspective. Okay, so we're going to talk broadly first about what should be done if there's a suspected injury, and then we're going to talk specifically about umpires. So the first piece is general information. This is for, and whoever's in charge, if it's the coach, if it's a parent, this is how generally a person should react to concussion. This is not necessarily what you're expected to do as an umpire, but we want you to understand the general approach. And then we're going to talk about specifically what your role could be. So the first point is, what if there are those red flags? What if there is a reason to suspect a more severe head injury or a neck injury? Just as in other situations, the ABCs and first aid principles apply. This is a calling 911 emergency potential situation. Because we're potentially suspecting a head or neck injury, the player should not be moved unless it's by a trained professional. Again, same first aid principles. You don't want to do any more damage to the spinal cord or the vertebrae. That includes, not removing the player's helmet or anything like that, that could cause shifting in that area. The exception, of course, is if, say, they're wearing a mask and it's affecting their ability to breathe. It's most important that they breathe. So these are all basic first aid principles, nothing unique to a potential concussion situation. If it's a medical emergency, that player needs to be accompanied at all times until transferred into medical care. And of course, it's really important to say that the emergency contact or parent or guardian is contacted in this scenario. Okay, so that's if there are red flags. We go straight into emergency mode, and the emergency action plan flows from there. But what if there's no red flags and there is a sign or symptom of concussion? Again, this is the general guidance, not specific to umpires, but a player with suspected concussion must be immediately removed from the field of play, and they should not be coming back into the same game or practice situation. What happens next is they need to be medically assessed. And this is all flowing directly from the Softball Canada concussion policy. They need to be medically assessed as soon as possible. This does not mean that they need to go to emerge, they can go see their family doctor. If it's, as soon as possible, same day, great. If it's the next morning, that's also okay. It's just that as soon as possible principle, again, as long as there's not emergency signs. And I wanted to come back to why this removal is so important. So I'm going to say for about the 100th time, and it's probably not the last time I'll say it tonight, we're talking about a brain injury, even though we have this conception, sometimes, relative to other more severe injuries, we call it a mild traumatic brain injury, but it's still a brain injury. Particularly when we're talking about youth under 18, their brains are in a really critical part of development. So it's a critical time to keep their brain safe. Youth also tend to take much longer than adults to recover from a concussion. A player who has a potential concussion and continues to play is put at further risk. One thing is, again, thinking about it's a brain injury, it might be affecting their decision-making, their reaction time, their coordination. If they're staying out on the field, they have the potential to get injured in another way. So again, thinking back to, your third base person, they're not quite right. They take a sharp hop, they could really get hurt even further than the concussion. So we don't want anybody on the field who's not sort of in the right space to play safely and play at their skill level. The other thing is that, this is quite rare, so this is not meant to scare anyone. But if you do have an injury to your brain and sustain another blow, that can have really severe consequences. So if any of you are familiar with the story behind the Rowan's Law legislation in Ontario, Rowan Stringer was a 17-year-old rugby player who sustained multiple concussions over the matter of a few days without exactly knowing she had a concussion. And because of the multiple blows to the head with no healing in between, she suffered what's known as second impact syndrome, which is where a condition where your brain swells and it leads to bleeding. And it tends to happen in young people, and it's typically fatal. And Rowan Stringer did die, and that's why we have sort of all the advocacy around concussion under the name of Rowan's Law. Again, this is not to tell scary stories and scare you more than we need to, but the point is that there is a risk, particularly for young people, to stay in a potential contact situation while they have an injury to their brain. We also know from the research that removing people from the activity, getting them the help that they need, and then getting them doing the things that help the brain recover actually affect how they recover in the long term, how they're going to experience the concussion and how quickly they get better. So it actually matters if you deal with it right away or we let it go on for a while. What is your role as an umpire? So we had mentioned about whether, talking about suspension of play. So of course, if the player is not in immediate danger, this is not a situation where play is suspended. There might be an example, and I'm throwing this example out there, so correct me if I'm wrong. If the pitcher takes a direct line drive to the head and is clearly knocked out, that's a situation where the player is in immediate danger, where 911 needs to be called, and that waiting could actually affect whether their life is saved or not. However, the scenario example we looked at where someone's knocked over with suspect concussion, then that's not necessarily immediate harm. You would wait till the play is complete and then call time as you typically would for another injury. Some other roles that may come up, and I think I'm seeing some of this in the chat, particularly if the emergency action plan is activated, and depending how that's happened, you may be asked to help to be a charge person to help, clear players away from overcrowding the injured person. You may be, helping clear the way, as I see in the chat, for medical personnel to come through if needed. So you may have a role there. We talked about kind of generally staying away from injury. So the primary action I think that we are suggesting you would take is if you see something, say something to the team leadership. So a alert the team leadership that you saw an impact, you saw, XYZ sign or symptom of concussion, and, under the policy, under the best interest of the individual, and if you're Ontario, even under the law, that, the proper procedure is to get that player checked. You are just conveying what you've witnessed to the leadership. According to the same guidelines you have for anything, this is a respectful, calm side conversation. So you carry on as you would in other situations. If you're required to fill out an injury report, that will also be part of your role here. I see someone comment that any player receives a direct impact to the head, time is called. So that's an answer to that question. I did want to acknowledge that, and you may have experienced this or witnessed this, is that you may be met with some resistance, or you may not see you may have a coach or a parent perhaps who is not really responding to what you've informed them of regarding witnessing some signs of concussion. So we've mentioned here just a few examples of some of the things that you might think about having in that conversation. So one of the things, and I mean, this is probably the first two, I listed them first, but those might be, depending on the situation, those might be the last ones you go to. You may want to start with, hey, let's look at what's best for the individual. But, you can lean into the Softball Canada policy or your provincial territorial federation's policy. Policy dictates that this player should be removed from the game. Again, it's not your role as the umpire to remove them. That's not your call. But knowing that now you have no excuse, you are informed of what the policy says. So kind of sharing that information. Again, in Ontario, it is also the law as well as the sport organization's policy. And Rowan's law does state that anyone suspected of having a concussion should be removed from play and cannot return until they're checked out. But there's also leaning into, again, here's what I saw, here's what I suspect, sharing that information. Sharing the knowledge that you have that them staying in could be a real risk to that player's safety, again, especially if they're young. Removing the player now is the best thing for their safety, the best thing for their return. They get out, they get checked. If there's no concussion, they can get back in the next game. If they have one, they can get back on recovery. But if this isn't checked out, it could be issues. So just thinking about some of these thoughts and ideas you might have in your back pocket that will help inform that conversation. And really, that's the best you can do, is use your training and knowledge to communicate that information across. What I also want to mention, and I know Jeff acknowledged this in the opening, is it's not just players that are at risk of getting a concussion. You as umpires are also at potential risk of concussion. So I think, one of the common things we've seen, again, particularly seen this in professional baseball and other examples, is, a ball off the mask, off the head is a pretty common example. But, a hard fall, also potentially colliding with a player, you're supposed to stay out of the way, but, things happen in the course of the game. So what happens if an umpire has a possible concussion? Well, the exact same principles apply in terms of it's about recognizing that the umpire has a possible concussion, actually removing them from the game as well, and they also need to get assessed. The important thing to note is that a person with a concussion can't always recognize that they have a concussion. And, they might be able to speak up that they're not feeling well, but we always don't want to necessarily put the full onus on the injured person. Again, you have a brain injury, you may not really know what's going on. They may not even remember sometimes if they've been in a, an impact. So what's really important is that we look out for each other. So if you are working a game with other umpires, look out for your crew. Hopefully, the coaches and players and others will be looking out for you as well. But if you see something, again, with one of your partners that you're working with, check in on them and, recognize signs and symptoms with them as well. If you're on the receiving end of that, be honest how you're feeling. Let's go back to that tough it out scenario. That's not what we want to do here. Being the tough guy that's going to stick with it, even though you're feeling a little off, is not what we want to do. You want to get checked out and make sure that it's quote unquote just a concussion, and get back on the road to recovery. I think that there's enough jokes out there about umpires' judgment, about umpires' vision. We don't need to add to it by playing with symptoms of a concussion where those things are actually physically happening to you. And then same rules apply for anyone who sustains a concussion. The process then is a gradual return to activities. So physical activity, work, school, and that includes umpiring. So if you're diagnosed with a concussion, you're not back to umpiring the next day. And I'll talk a little bit about that process to kind of wrap us up. I'm just going to take a quick look at the chat. Lots of good conversation going. I don't think I necessarily have much to add. So what if the coach thinks that the player is all right? So again, this is the point where there is that conversation piece that we just talked about in terms of conveying information to the coach. If they hopefully, through that conversation, you can make a decision of, they can make a decision on what's in the best interest of the athlete. And I can give you an example of, not an umpire coach scenario, but I was substituting with a team of adults, and it wasn't my regular team, and I'd only met them once before. And after the top of the first inning, our pitcher was walking back to the dugout and was like, "Well, I've seen stars out there," and he didn't know the work that I do, and I was like, "What are you talking about?" And he mentioned that he was practicing around earlier that day and took a ball to the head, and he actually even had a cut from it, and he was dizzy. And I said, "Okay, well, that's not great." And "Oh no, I'm kidding. I was totally kidding. I'm fine. What I did in that situation, being the new person, not knowing really how to approach him, I talked to the teammates, told them my concerns, asked them what the best way to approach him was, and essentially had to sit him from the game and said, you're really not going back out there. Now that's a different scenario, being a teammate, being an equal, than being an umpire. But a lot of this comes down to conversation. This is, this question of, a coach or a parent or others really kind of refusing to follow protocol. There's only so much you can do. It happens in every sport, but I think certainly the most important part is having those conversations. So we want to talk a little bit about the return piece and what that process looks like. And then we'll get into a bit of prevention. And I think, I think we'll still have a little bit more time, and I think we can potentially talk a little bit more about some of the questions you have about removal, if we're still feeling a little uncomfortable and not confident about this piece. So once a player is removed from the game, they do need to get assessed. Again, this is under the Softball Canada policy, and there's essentially two avenues this can go. Either they are checked out and they don't have a concussion, and that means that they can resume their activities as normal. There's no, special road to recovery there. They don't have a concussion. If they are diagnosed with a concussion, there is that gradual process of return to daily activities, physical activities, school and work that I mentioned. And in the case of, for example, softball, that player wouldn't be allowed to resume playing in games unless they have medical clearance. So they do need to be essentially fully recovered before coming back into a full game situation. In terms of return to play, that is not the umpire's role. That is for the sport organization and the coach and those in charge of that component of the protocol to control. I don't know if there's any, I actually wouldn't even think that even in a tournament situation, I guess the only thing would be checking the lineups to make sure all the players on the lineup card are eligible. But even that, I'm not even sure if that's within an umpire's purview or if that's up to the organization that's running the event to make sure that all players there are eligible. That's the only potential place where I could even see an umpire having any role there, any say there. So it's not your role to help progress the player back to play or determine whether they've been cleared or not. That's more generally for your information about how where the protocol comes full circle. Again, I'm going to talk a little bit about go quickly through this idea of gradual return to activities. This is not, again, particularly to your role, but for your information, as well as this is valuable information, again, if you should sustain a concussion yourself. Return to, school and work activities. So we kind of consider these, mental activities that take a lot of concentration, thinking, memorization, testing, looking at a screen. These are activities that you progress through. And the idea is that you slowly add on activities without aggravating concussion symptoms. So the old approach, which some of you might be familiar with, was you sit in a dark room, we wait until you're totally better, and then you can resume activities. What we now know is that is not the answer at all. What we need to do is actually gradually build ourselves back up, expose our brain to a bit more of a load as much as it can handle, and progress back. So this process on here on the screen talks mostly about school, but it's the same principles process to getting back to work and getting back to umpiring activities. Same goes for return to sport, and Softball Canada has a return to softball strategy where they've taken kind of the gradual general steps and put some softball specific examples to it. So, as you can see on here, there's a bit of time before a player is actually getting back to even a team practice and full practice situation, let alone getting back into a game. And there's a couple of reasons. One is gradually reintroducing, the brain to, taking on the efforts of exercise, taking on the efforts of, coordination, bat to ball, that sort of mental stimulation, but also until a person is healed and recovered, we don't want to place them back into a high risk environment. So until they're healed, we don't want them getting into the game where they could again be in a collision, get hit by a ball, until we know that they're recovered. And again, same thing would be not putting you back into umpiring too soon, where you would have a risk of getting hit again while you're still recovering. Under the policy, there is medical requirements, medical clearance, required to return. Generally for young people, this process takes about 4 weeks, and for adults, it takes about 2 weeks, but there is a percentage of people who can take longer. So we can't necessarily predict exactly how long it's going to take. It could take weeks, months. Some people, experience symptoms longer than a year. But the good news is most people will actually recover fairly quickly, and that recognition, removal, that gradual recovery are all influences on how quickly that recovery happens, as well as some other factors that we can't control about our individual selves. I want to talk a little bit about prevention. For the sake of time, think I'm going to move us right into talking about it rather than necessarily opening up for discussion. But maybe as I'm starting to transition slides, give yourself some thought from what you've learned and what you as an umpire actually might have a role in creating a safer, more concussion safe environment for all participants, and including yourself as well. So a lot of what can contribute to concussion prevention or the reduction of consequences due to concussion is a lot of the things that you're already doing that contribute to a safe environment and will prevent other types of injury or safety concerns. So any part that has any part of your role that relates to checking field conditions, so if that's keeping an eye on the pitcher's mound and how that's dug in and things like that, anything that you can do there that will contribute. You know, preventing players from falling is a big one, falling and hitting their head, falling and getting an impact on the ground. Proper equipment, so for yourself, you know, your mask, your throat protector, your chest protector if you need one for fast pitch. You know, footwear is important. Again, a lot about fall prevention here. So staying on your feet, and then also enforcing any player equipment rules. Again, you know, helmets and the like, helmets, cleats, you know, safety around the bases, things like that. Game control can be an important aspect of this, particularly, you know, controlling player-to-player contact, you know, aggressive pitching, things like that. Just, you know, again, general safety considerations. Enforcing rules, particularly those that are aimed at safety, is really important. All really about creating that safe environment. We talk about you know, facial protection, head protection, really important. What we do need to emphasize is a helmet does not necessarily prevent a concussion. Helmets are really important to you know, reduce the impact to your head. Helmets can prevent all sorts of injuries, protect your skull. So skull fracture is a very serious injury. Can protect your brain from other injuries as well. What it doesn't necessarily do is prevent a concussion. So I promised I'd come back to my story. You've probably forgotten about that by now, but I'm going to bring it back up. The way that I sustained a concussion playing softball is that I was running to first base and the shortstop basically gunned a throw that hit me right in the side of the head. I was wearing a helmet. I play in a slow pitch league. It is completely optional. But of course, doing what I do, I've always worn a helmet. I'm pretty convinced that it saved my life because it did hit me directly in the temple. The first base person got not a bit of glove on it. You know, talking to the shortstop after, he said, you know, I put some extra on it because you were going too fast down the line. So I actually ended up with a large lump on the side of my head. And I actually could feel the shot of the ball ring through my head from ear to ear. And, you know, I did get checked out because of that lump, but, you know, all was okay with my skull. It was still just a concussion, but it was just a really important example of why that helmet doesn't necessarily prevent. If you go back to that video that we watched about the head shaking, a helmet can hold, you know, it holds the outside of your head. It doesn't hold that brain still inside your head, keep that from moving. But again, really important to protect the head in other ways. Again, just, you know, rule enforcement, particularly where it's going to, you know, reduce collisions, reduce head contact, reduce risk of concussion. You know, promoting that open relationship of discussion with the coaches, you know, with respect to, you know, the rules that you have to follow, the guidelines you have to follow about fraternizing, not trying to contravene those, but, you know, having that respectful conversational relationship with the coach can go a long way here in having those discussions. And of course, staying educated yourself, you know, staying up to date, you know, with new information, repeating this type of education is really important to continue to, you know, keep your skills sharp and help you continue to understand what to look for and what you might be able to do. There are a number of sources of information about concussion that are freely available. including more information on our Parachute website, as well as Coaching Association of Canada has a free e-learning module named Making Headway in Sport. I realize that consulting a coach resource is not that appealing to officials. It doesn't feel like it's designed for you. However, I would encourage you to check it out because it's targeted to coaches. It talks a lot about these scenarios where they're dealing with a bit of pushback from a parent. They have questions about liability and what their role is. So I actually think that going through that module, which is not very long and it's very scenario based, can help you think more about some of these questions that we're talking about. What would you do in these scenarios? What would your decision making be? What can those conversations be? And supply some of that information to have those conversations like we've been talking about tonight. There's also, some information, some free e-learning training on a resource called CAT, the Concussion Awareness Training Tool, and the Sport Information Resource Center has a number of resources. And all of these organizations were all aligned in our information. I'll also mention that Parachute does have a free app, Concussion Ed. If you have your device on you a lot, this might be something to download. There is a concussion recognition list with the signs and symptoms in there. So if you didn't have a concussion recognition tool on you, that's also a resource. And depending what you check, it gives some more instruction about what should happen in that scenario. Before I maybe hand it back over to Donna and Jeff and see if we want to have any more discussion or we want to wrap it up for tonight, just a quick recap of the 4 R's of concussion: recognize signs and symptoms of concussion. Just one sign or symptom is enough. Remove. You as the umpire may not be the one making the call to remove a person, but you're communicating what you saw to the leadership and supporting the best possible decision for the safety of the athlete and potentially for yourself or your umpiring crew. That person should be referred for medical assessment, and then it's that gradual return to sport, to school, to daily life, and of course to the umpiring work that I'm going to assume you love. So thank you so much for listening to the presentation. Thank you for your comments, your questions, your discussion, and I will hand it back over to Donna. Feel free to check us out and reach out to us if you have anything further you want to explore. Thank you, everyone.
Wow, thank you, Stephanie. And that was very enlightening this evening. And Rachel, I know that there's lots of questions and comments, and I think the biggest thing that I took away from this evening is that while we are not the primary, especially in youth games, the primary adjudicator of whether or not a player is capable or is ready to play in that game physically or mentally. We understand that their coaches and their parents know them better and know their history. It is important that we take a role in making sure that we are protecting those players by communicating with coaches when we see injuries, and that the biggest thing is, especially with youth, that we protect them and at whatever we need to do. And we can do a lot of that, as you said, just by having good, honest conversations, respectful conversations with coaches, and reminding them of their obligations under both our policies and, in some provinces, the law. So.
Thank you, Jeff. That's wonderful. And I think, Jeff, you and I were having a conversation. I was saying, what you just said, it's a team effort, not to be cliche, but coaches have a role, parents have a role, players have a role. And as part of this system that makes sport what it is, as everyone gets more on board with this, as everyone learns this information and starts to play their role, I think it will be easier for all of us to do what we need to do, and the resistance will go down, and we'll all feel more confident that we're, supporting the safety of players.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much. On behalf of Softball Canada and our National Umpire Program, I want to thank both of you for taking the time to share your experience and your expertise around this topic tonight.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
And you know, I've learned a lot about this and a lot this evening too, and I am sure our umpires have as well. As umpire leaders, it is important that we are able to support all participants as they play our sport safely. Just a reminder that we have recorded this and it will be on our umpire YouTube channel to have a look at it in the future.
Of course, we want to thank all 62 of you that showed up tonight. So our umpire leaders from across the country, our level 4 and level 5 umpires, thank you so much. You're taking the time to do this shows why you're part of our umpire leading group. So we really appreciate their time to taking their time to participate. That concludes our little get together this evening. If you do have additional questions or want additional information about preventing injury, I would encourage you guys to go check out Parachute at parachute.ca. Did I get that right? Good. Thanks, everybody, and good night.
Thank you, guys.